In this episode, the Park Service demonstrates to us how to properly maintain a trough, making sure it stays clean. We also learn that there is no drought, unless you're a rancher, and then it's the worst drought on record. But if you're wildlife, there is no drought and you have plenty of water. And on a more serious note, I share a little bit from recent interviews with actual Tule Elk experts who have observed the suffering of the elk that is taking place right now, and we get their perspective on the situation. Worth noting, the only remaining body of water in the Tule Elk Reserve is quickly on its way to becoming last year's death trap, if any of you watched the episode about Central Pond 2. In other words, attempting to get water might also kill these elk.
Will you describe in your own words the physical difficulty and the timidness and the anxiety of those animals trying to get water from such a dangerous situation?
Yeah, so they proceed down to the water very carefully, and there are tracks that are made by previous elk. They don't just go in anywhere. They go in because they're herd animals. They go in where the previous elk look like they've been successful. So they'll follow the exact same track.
Hmm.
Some of them are so weak that they can't pull themselves out when they get there. They're actually leaning on their chests and stretching their necks out as far as they possibly can to get water. And then when they try to back out, they have trouble and they try over and over and over again. And eventually, the ones I've seen, they've gotten out. I've also seen elk go down to the water and they start to go in and then they get spooked and they turn around and just walk away. And we don't know what's happening to them. They're obviously in a weakened state already and they are afraid that they're going to get stuck. And I've seen that at least 3 times down there just in the last week.
So I just want to make this painfully clear for the viewers. Even if that was a healthy animal, you're putting it in a situation where it's going to have a fairly challenging time crawling out of there. But now you're throwing in the mix that it's already a weakened animal. Its muscles have not been nourished. It's not getting what it needs. And now it has to try and navigate a challenge like that. And the chances of failure just start to pile up.
And also it's resulting in a failure of reproduction because without a certain level, they're unable to reproduce or they're unable to sustain or nurse their young or they're unable to protect their young or they're just unable to breed mate. And so with all the different things that happen when they're in a weakened state and nutrient deprived,
Well,
it's just leading to more.
imagine the nutritional requirements to carry and develop life inside of you. And then let's say it
Exactly.
manages to give birth, and then you still have to feed it. It's so I'm laughing because I'm so uncomfortable with the image in my head of an emaciated mother trying to give a starving baby milk that she doesn't have. And this is what our Park Service
Exactly.
is okay with. That's a nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate you pointing that out. To me, they're magnificent. And being around them has been an honor.
I'm sorry that it's so upsetting. I understand why it is depressing, especially the more you're out there and the more you observe them, the more you appreciate these animals. It's not just a name on a piece of paper anymore. It really is a magnificent creature, as you're saying, and it's ridiculous that they're suffering like this.
And that we put them in this situation. We made a commitment to restore the population. That was a part of the deal. Bring them to Point Reyes. Let
Yeah,
them.
it's not their fault. They didn't make a bad decision in nature. We did this to them.
We did this to them. And we need to carry the baggage that we created, and we need to do right by them.
Good morning. I thought I'd better do a Tule Elk update. Things are escalating out there quickly. There's a lawsuit. The pond The one remaining pond is almost empty. The Park Service has delivered more of their ridiculous statements, and things are looking pretty dire for the elk, even though activists are trying very hard to help them. So, what all have you missed? Let's go through it. We should rewind a little bit, go back a few months, several months actually, to one of the efforts made by activists to bring water to the elk. And what's interesting about that, it was, condemned by the Park Service. The Park Service gave several reasons for their stance on it. But the reason I want to rewind is that this is when the ranchers were starting to declare their emergency need for water, and we started seeing water pumps appearing around McClure's Ranch and Kehoe Ranch. And I just want that to sink in a little bit, that while there are claims that the wildlife are fine, it was deemed necessary to allow pumping of water in order to assist the ranchers and their commodity animals due to a drought emergency. About the same time, we saw new troughs showing up across the pasture land in the ranching areas, not to be confused with the older troughs that the ranchers have used over the years, but these were all uniform. They all looked the same and they all looked new. So here we have the Park Service providing troughs for cattle, which means it's for the ranchers because they are making money off of their business, which is cattle, all while refusing to bring in troughs for the elk. Now let's fast forward a little ways. Activists tried again to bring in water. They were condemned again for doing so. Some of the reasons were that troughs provide a drowning threat to certain animals, smaller ones that can't crawl out, can't verify the water quality. Troughs have to be cleaned. You got to keep from algae and other types of buildup from taking place, and also stating that elk are likely not going to drink from foreign objects like the troughs. Fast forward again, what does the Park Service do? They bring in troughs after repeatedly stating this was not the right strategy. They also stated while bringing in water troughs that the elk did not need water. As they brought in water, they said the elk do not need water. They did say that the elk needed forage. They would not provide forage, but they would provide the thing that they said was not needed. Now let's go back and talk about the other troughs for a little bit. Remember the drowning threat to small animals? Well, you go and you look at all the troughs that the ranchers have placed out in the pastoral zone in their fields, and those do not have ramps. They do not have what the Park Service described as necessary to prevent undesired deaths of other animals trying to drink from those troughs. So activists should be held to that standard, but not the people that work and lease land within a national seashore. Now, why would the Park Service provide something that they claim is not needed is one question. Why would the Park Service only put troughs at the southern end, which is actually below Pierce Point Ranch, below the parking lot, next to a highly trafficked area, and not attempt to take water out to the northern area, which seemed to be the most physically unhealthy looking elk? How else to say it than that? Now, I'm not done talking about these troughs yet, because remember the water quality concern and the algae and the need to maintain troughs, which I guess ranchers are supposed to do in their troughs. Well, take a look at the rancher troughs. Yeah, well done. But look at the Park Service's troughs. I mean, it's one thing to make this claim about troughs that are scattered all across the seashore and that it's ultimately the rancher's responsibility to keep them clean or whatever. but we are talking about the troughs that the Park Service brought inside the Tule Elk Reserve that are right next to the road after stating that they needed to be maintained, that are absolutely not being maintained. How hard is it? You're Park Service staff in a national seashore, and you can't get someone to go out there and at least skim the surface so it looks like you're pretending like you care? Here's an interesting shot. You have an elk on ranch land next to a rancher trough. What's the correct way to describe the situation? Is the elk about to be endangered by low water quality? Or is the elk endangering the rancher's livelihood because he might want some of that water? Based on the Park Service's history of action and their recent statements, both are true, but they would only take action to remove the elk in this case for the sake of the rancher. Whereas if activists had provided that dirty water, then they could say that they were protecting the elk. One way or another, the Park Service always manages to make sure that the wildlife get the shaft. I went out there for a few days at the beginning of July, and then I went back out a couple of weeks after that. And here are a few of the things that I observed. The troughs that the Park Service put in do have elk congregating in that area, but the elk have always congregated in that area. It's a watering hole area. I went to Central Pond 2, which if you watched the Adequate Water series, you will recognize as a spot last year that elk that were desperate to try and find water were walking through what is basically a La Brea tar pit type of trap, deep mud, hoping to find some water in the middle, and ultimately got trapped, could not crawl out, and ultimately met their doom sitting stuck in mud. I mean, God only knows how the actual end eventually came around for those poor animals. But two corpses in Central Pond 2, and then the Park Service stated that they found another elk stuck in Central Pond 2 after that. So not one, not two, 3 animals that we know of in a death trap with the bodies of their own kind in that death trap, still congregating around what is historically a watering source for that subherd, continuing to hang out in an area that basically has death written all over it, and there's no water to be found. Why are they doing that? Keep that in mind. So I went all the way out to North Pond 2, and it was the lowest I've ever seen it, which is pretty darn low. And you can see disturbed soil around the edges of it. It looked like they were maybe struggling to drag themselves away, which I would find out from other people later on was in fact what that was evidence of. But what immediately came to mind is, wow, this is about to become another Central Pond 2. Elk are about to face the same desperation level where they are risking death by getting stuck in extremely deep mud in order to reach the tiny last little bit of water that is in the middle of that drying up pond. Why is that significant? Well, we go back to this argument that a few know-it-all couch experts proclaimed that the elk would be fine because of the troughs down at the southern side. Well, great. That makes a lot of sense. All the elk and other wildlife just, I guess, got a memo on their smartphones that there was at the other end, and now they're going to ignore their instincts and their home ranges and march across the elk reserve to these foreign objects. Remember that the Park Service already has doubts would even be attractive enough for the elk to overcome their fear and drink out of. So it's one thing if this is just me talking out of my butt, but I have Judd Howell, who holds his PhD in wildlife biology and worked on a study related to the Tule Elk Management Plan, which, by the way, points out home ranges that the elk within the elk reserve stuck to, which they learned by observation and by using radio collars, which proved that they divided into subherds and stuck to their home ranges. We also have Julie Phillips, a biologist who has studied elk in California for 30 years. And we also have a 3-year Tule Elk docent who worked for Point Reyes National Seashore as a Tule Elk docent, all of whom speak to the fact that these animals have home ranges and will stick to those home ranges despite the fact that they are a traveling species of animal, but of course they're not allowed to do that in Point Reyes National Seashore because of a fence. And even if they were, that does not mean that subherds don't have areas that they stick to. If you spend a lot of time in Point Reyes National Seashore, you will see the same elk. If you happen to learn how to distinguish some identifying marks on their hides or whatnot, you will see those same elk at the same spots. For example, an easy one to notice is that it's almost always just young males around North Pond 2. Almost always. That's obviously a pattern with the elk that stick to that area. At Central Pond 2, the spot that last year was a death trap, and this year I went to, and it was already completely dry, so dry that it doesn't even really pose a mud death trap anymore because there's no moisture in it. There are still elk hanging out there. Still elk hanging out there. Why? Why are they hanging out where there isn't any water? Answer that. Did they not get the memo about the troughs? Or is it the fact that they stick to home ranges? Is it the fact that that has been their spot for generations? Now, if you're willing, you can listen to my full interviews with each of those people I already listed so that you can hear them put into words what these elk must be going through. And most recently, I spoke to Laura, the former Tule Elk docent, and she was in tears describing these elk wanting the water but being skittish and afraid to approach the water because of the risk that was involved. It's like, and what kind of risk? You know, there's a lot of types of risk. This is an animal that is in nature a prey item, even if the predators are gone from Point Reyes National Seashore or in short supply in Point Reyes National Seashore. Instinctively, you don't want to be down in a watering hole without the ability to escape quickly. So that's one reason to be skittish. The other one is, hey, this is so deep, I may not be able to get out. That source of life over there that I need to get to could also spell my doom. What a nice way to be living your life in a national seashore. Hey, I need that water over there, but it could also kill me because I could get stuck. It could also kill them because of the filth that's within that water. You read those autopsies and you read about the worms eating their lungs and the systemic infections. You know, that water doesn't look promising. I don't think anyone watching this would ever drink from that water. Then you hear these elk experts talk about the skin and bones and the basically just frame of these animals and how they were trembling and weak. These are large animals that don't have any sustenance inside of them, that are struggling just to survive, much less pull themselves through chest-deep mud to get a sip of something they desperately need. That's messed up. You might not be comfortable putting yourself in the shoes of an animal or sympathizing with an animal, but bottom line is that's messed up. So we've got all the elk experts that I listed, and then on the other side you've got Dave Press, who is basically a glorified ranch hand who spends his time working on the ranches, but then you know, he carries the credential of being Park Service staff, the ecologist out there, or biologist. They switch his title whenever it's suitable for them to do so in the press. And this guy is supposed to, his assumptions and wild claims about these animals, it's supposed to be all that's necessary to sedate the public and be like, no, no, we know what we're talking about. We got it under control. This is from the same park staff that said the elk don't need water and then brought in water, said that the troughs need to be clean, and then didn't bother to clean their own troughs. The same Park Service staff who have access to Tule elk, a rare and endemic species, and haven't conducted any studies of their own on these animals in recent history. The ones that claim that the elk don't need water, yet you have elk risking death in order to get to some water. I guess they're just doing that for fun. They don't need that water. They're just like, hey, let's play a little game of chicken today. Let's see who can get closest to being mortally stuck. Not because we need the water. It's just fun. It's just fun to play a survival game when we're already skin and bones. Has nothing to do with the elk needing the water. They're just doing it for the hell of it. And as if everything I already said wasn't enough, you also have a habitat that is pretty much dominated by invasive plants, agricultural European introduced plants, not the forage that the elk want or need, but what has taken over the seashore thanks to the prioritization of ranching activity, where you would at least hope that wildlife would finally receive some sort of prioritization. And as for these claims by the Park Service that the fog drip, the moisture carried in the air from the ocean, is a great source of water, this is what that soil looks like. This is even in the greenest parts. This is what the ground looks like after the fog drip. That place is dry as a bone. To go along with my own footage, I also am sharing some footage by Tony Segal. Thank you very much, Tony. Jack and Laura said I could use some of their photos, and just want you to have some visuals to go along with these claims. They're not really claims, these are observations. This is what reality is when you go out there and you stop and you look for a while, instead of just reading BS claimed by a Park Service owned by the ranchers. Let's not forget a few more of the claims coming from the Park Service, such as stating that the elk don't hang out around the fence. There's no evidence that the elk want out. Pretty much everyone going out there is seeing the elk at the fence. And I want to thank, in addition to the people I already mentioned, Matthew Pulverosa Klein and the group People for Point Reyes for sharing some of their images as well. And of course I have mine. Elk are at that fence all the time. You can make your own denial argument about exactly what they're doing at the fence, but let's at least start with the acknowledgement that claiming that they aren't at it is a lie. And let's follow that up with Dave Press's claim that there's proof that the elk don't need water because their trail cam is not picking up elk drinking from the trough. Why do they only have one trail cam up if they're really trying to monitor the elk behavior? They have 3 troughs up there. Is that where the budget ran out with the cheap little trail cam? Do we even know the Park Service is sharing all their footage? And isn't this the same Park Service that criticized activists for trying to bring in troughs because elk likely won't drink out of these foreign objects? There's so much to cover here. I just kind of quickly jumped past the fact that they're pumping water over in the other parts of the seashore because of the drought emergency. And then the drought only escalated after that. So those pumps have been out there for a long time. And last time I was there, they were still there. This is in a state that since then has declared this as the worst drought on record and is bailing out ranchers and farmers because they don't have enough water. They already used up all the water, and now we're trucking in more water for them to continue to deplete our water supply, all while in a national seashore, a little peninsula set aside by the national government to preserve and protect a portion of our diminishing coastline. Even the wildlife there don't get to have water because it's being pumped for the sake of agriculture, the very thing that has depleted the entire rest of the state of its water source. But the Tule Elk are fine if that's easier for you to accept. And we have plenty of water too, by the way.
There is no drought. There are no wildfires. The sea isn't rising. Cows will save the planet. Mission accomplished.